Jason Edwards, Professor of History and Humanities at Grove City College, is with us today. He plays board games with his two young sons around the family table, and often includes his extended family, students, new friends, and he says, quote, "It's a reason for people to get together. The historic strength of the American family has dramatically waned," says Professor Edwards. And an exception to this phenomenon are the pieces of cardboard that have bucked these trends. The modern board game renaissance, how board games are saving Western civilization, one family table at a time. I'm going to emphasize the subject of that his loving wife Jennifer is here in the audience, and they, in a couple of days, will celebrate their 25th wedding anniversary. For some inexplicable reason, they're spending it with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Building a Community with Cardboard is the title of Professor Edwards' lecture.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Paul and ABC. Oh, there I am. For sponsoring this and so forth. I'm gonna confess to something right out of the gate here. Though they've been very generous to let me speak, because, to be honest, I was very confused as to what why I was coming. Now I agreed to come before I even knew that Diana Ross was going to be here. So that was wonderful last night. I'm sure you all enjoyed that. But to be honest, I thought it was going to be Gladys Knight. And I thought I was coming to try out for the Pips, you know. And so that's really what I had prepared. But it turned out it was Diana Ross instead. But that was delightful. And so they said, well, can't you talk about anything else? And I said, well, I suppose I can. Give it a shot. And so board games, and so I understand Chautauqua is looking at games and how they demonstrate our humanity, or a part of our humanity, and I agree with that, and I enjoyed the lecture this morning too that was on games and how that's a part of human nature. And so that was a generous introduction that Paul gave me, and so my name is Jason Edwards, and I work at Grove City College, which is in western Pennsylvania, and several of you kindly came up and identified yourself as alumni, or that your children or grandchildren come to Grove City College, and so I appreciate that, and we appreciate that, and I don't have anything to sell, but my college might be manifested, like, do advocate, like, send your grandchildren, send your children to Grove City College. And for those of you interested in balance, and it's an honor to be invited by ABC here, then I can assure you that Grove City College is one of the growing, to be honest with you, few places that I think that you actually do get balance and fairness in higher education. It's become a rough place in many ways, and too insular and isolated in its thinking, and Grove City College doesn't reflect that. So I think it is a good institution. All right, well, need to get my clicker here. For the talk, I am going to get to board games in a minute, but why? So in 1995, a book that I think is one of the most significant of the 20th century, frankly, came out by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. And his original article came out in 1995, and then the book came out in 2000, and he's come out with an anniversary edition of it where he kind of updates it and so forth. But the point is still the same, and that point is cleverly captured, if you're not familiar with the book, with this phrase, bowling alone. Now, the book is about social capital. And so, you're familiar with capital. So it takes money to make money. But we're not talking about traditional money and capital here. We're talking about social capital. So societies have a social capital if they're healthy. That means that the relations between the people are that they have healthy relations, that they trust one another, and particularly democracies, particularly republics, need a high level of social capital for them to work well, that people generally trust one another, that they know that people will follow the rules, that people will contribute, and so forth. And so Robert Putnam said way back, again in 1995, started to saying that in America, our social capital is getting dangerously low, that we don't seem to interact with one another, we consequently don't trust one another, we don't like one another, we're at loggerheads with one another and so forth. And obviously, from the vantage point of 2023, I don't have to make much of a case, I would think, for you all to say, yeah, that seems to, be our society today. So some people say, it's the most fractious that the United States has ever been. I'm a historian, so I rush to say, well, wait a minute, we haven't killed 700,000 of one another yet, and so forth. So the 1860s was a little rougher than right now, but undoubtedly, we seem to be at loggerheads in a very divided society, and that causes us increasing difficulty. So, so this idea is captured in Bowling Alone. So Putnam isn't primarily interested of why are we bowling alone, but it really captures the idea well. And so that idea is what he noted was that in the United States, more people than ever are bowling. So in some sense, the bowling industry is doing just fine and well. But at the same time that more people than ever are bowling, bowling leagues have essentially disappeared. Well, you might say, well, who cares? Well, why you should potentially care is that, think about it, that a bowling league is a group of people who are friends or know one another that agree that we're going to meet together every week at a certain time to do this activity. And oh, by the way, when we go and do this activity, we're going to have another group of people that may be similar to us, that may not be, but that we don't know, that's going to be bowling right beside us. And so so that forced an interaction. And so if I'm part of this bowling league, I get to know the people on my team more and more, and we become closer and closer friends, and I interact with them. Plus, I get to know people that I otherwise would not have met and known. And so that's just naturally building up capital, this social capital idea, with fellow citizens, because you get to know one another. And not incidental either that may well include, a variety of generations of people. And so Bowling Alone is a way to capture this idea of the deteriorating social capital in the United States. And so I just listed off some other elements of this. I don't want to be too much of a downer, but obviously we know that divorce and broken families and so forth is a more and more prominent thing that we've had to wrestle with. Our communities seem to be getting more and more divided. Again, this bowling alone idea, because it's like Putnam just goes after, just activity after activity and group after group and shows this is the trend, that we just don't interact much anymore with one another. And I'm happy to be at Chautauqua because I think this would be one of the few places where, well, maybe this gets countered a little bit here, this idea, but this isn't dominant in American society. I like to get distracted by point number 3. I'll try not to get overly distracted by it, but we have a broken communication system. What do I mean by that? Well, you've got you carry around now a machine in your pocket that claims that it's keeping you in contact with one another, but I would argue is much more effectively keeping you very isolated. And people go through their lives with their heads bowed, and not to God, but to this machine, and are very distracted. I teach at a college. I go through the halls, and my college is pretty friendly, or is known as being pretty friendly, but I give the students an awful hard time because almost all of them are just sitting there shoulder to shoulder with people, but ignoring them and interacting with this machine. And so that is isolating to us. Another really important book of the 20th century excuse me, is Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, which maybe you're familiar with, but if you're not, it was written in 1980, published in 1985, but is definitely worth reading still in 2023. And he was arguing about the influence of television and saying that television has changed the nature of our society. And here again, the best line I've ever heard about television was that it's a machine that allows millions of people to laugh at the same joke at the same time and still be lonely. So it's an isolating machine. It might be, sometimes it's okay if you gather as a family and you're watching some show as a group, and maybe that helps gather you together, and maybe you'll discuss it afterwards. But and I don't want this to sound creepy, but like if I walk through my neighborhood at night and you glance at the houses, not in a peeping Tom type of way and so forth, but what will you see? Glowing blue lights, but not one. You'll see glowing blue lights in essentially every window. Well, what does that mean? That means that you've got people living in the same house that are isolating themselves from one another. They're not interacting with one another. They're isolated in their own room watching their own show. And so we become very divided. So in a lot of ways, then I'm suggesting that we have this broken way of life that plays out in our society, in our politics, in our families, and so forth, that needs addressing and healing. So what is my solution? And as my questions are like, I think you should be like, are you kidding? Like you think that board games are going to help? Not these ones. So these are some of the most popular board games in history. My wife is, she likes going to yard sales. I guess the official term now is picker and so forth. I would have thought that was an insult, but no, that's a good thing, I guess. So she's a picker, and you go to any yard sale that she's drugged me to, there's always a pile of these games there, because who wants them and who likes them? They're not particularly good. Now, some of you might like a couple of these, and I'm not trying to attack that and so forth. And in fact, if you'll allow me a good-natured joke, I noticed that I'm speaking right outside, if I get my directions here correctly, but a Presbyterian chapel and the Presbyterian house, and the college that I work at is very associated with the Presbyterian church. Candyland is arguably the greatest Presbyterian Calvinist game, because you just shuffle those cards, and once the game has started, like it's predestined who has won and who has lost, and so where there's no decisions, no actions that are made, it's already done once the game has started. So I don't want to get in an argument of if that's good theology or not, but it is poor game design and so forth. So that's not that doesn't make for a fantastic game. So what I'm suggesting is that these games can help our situation. And so, well, what do you mean? Like, what's the difference here? And I'm not selling any games, and I don't make any profit from any games and so forth. But I just want to let you know, and I'm going to switch. I guess I'll say, like, well, what can board games do? I'll come back to this. But I'm going to shift to here, excuse me. And this is a picture of Klaus Teuber, and I'm going to say that this is the face of a revolutionary. But maybe more accurately, this is the face of a Renaissance man. And Klaus Teuber unfortunately passed away on April 1st of this year, and I wrote a tribute to him that was picked up in some of the papers, and Paul read it, and that's how we got acquainted and connected me here with ABC at Chautauqua. But Klaus Teuber, also in 1995, so 1995 plays a key role for this talk. So 1995 is when Putnam came out with his essay, Bowling Alone, and that is when Klaus Teuber published the game The Settlers of Catan in Germany. And the Settlers of Catan went on to win the Spiel des Jahres, which is the German game of the year, and went on to become the best-selling Euro game of all time. And so what I'm wanting to talk to you about, or where I think that not the solution to all of our society's problems, but a contributing, but something that could help, is this rise of the popularity of Euro games, and what I would argue is an improvement on board games that can make them attractive to more groups of people. And Catan demonstrated that this is possible in 1995. Okay, so I'm a historian, so just briefly here a little bit, and you probably would get this in other talks this week regarding games and play and so forth, but there seems to be something about games that is just hardwired into our nervous system. And I would argue maybe specifically here board games and so forth. So if we go back to ancient Egypt, we're not sure exactly how it worked and so forth, but we know there's this board game Senet, which might be the oldest board game in the world, and here they are pictured playing it. The other candidate for oldest board game in the world is the Royal Game of Ur. So Irving Frankel, a curator at the British Museum in London, says that he actually has met someone who played the Royal Game of Ur as a child, and so he's saying this game has lasted longer than any civilization in history. So it's lasted thousands of years, and we still know what the rules of this game are, and that people have played it for thousands of years. So this is him playing a YouTube aficionado here on the Royal Game of Ur. And then in ancient Greek pottery, here's Achilles and Ajax. We don't know if it's Catan that they're playing, but they're sitting down to play apparently some board game in the ancient world. So board games, we tend to associate back with this type of thing, which would be more of a toy or something that we expect to do or we think is made for little children. But historically, they were more frequently diplomatic activities. They were considered that you would have a toy for a child, but a game is more something for an adult. And I would say that Catan is more in that line. So the popularity, if you did not know, of board games, specifically modern board games or contemporary ones or Euro games, is skyrocketing. So some of that is obviously speculation of where it's headed, but the revenue generated from board games is gone into the billions. Kickstarter, if you don't know, is a popular, I think frequently board games is the most funded thing on Kickstarter. So Kickstarter, if you don't know, is an internet site where you can go and say, I have this idea, would you be willing to fund it? Or, if I make this game, you can buy it, reserve a copy early and so forth, but I need the money to actually make the thing, and so you go and support it. So Kickstarter has thousands now of board games that are successfully kickstarted on that website every year due to their popularity and interest in them. Here again, we're in the hundreds of millions of dollars has been earned just on Kickstarter. So this isn't necessarily big board game companies. This is sometimes individuals, it's sometimes small board game companies and so forth that are generating an awful lot of interest on Kickstarter. So ultimately, what I'm suggesting with this talk and where I would want to go and would hope that this might be a practical suggestion for you is that what if we got to the point where the generations wanted to spend time together? So in other words, like when and I'm not arguing that you don't, and because I think that you do want to spend time with your children. I think you do want to spend time with your grandchildren. But well, I'll jump a little bit out of order of what I was going to say, but like, how did I find board games? So travel back, it's 2011, and my wife and I have a 6-year-old son at that time. And we're like, well, we want to do stuff with our son, but what are we going to do? I don't want to sit in front of the television with my child, and we wouldn't want to watch the same things anyway. And so it's like, oh, well, maybe we can try some games and so forth. And it's like, so that's what we did. So we got out like Monopoly. I was like, well, what's the game? Well, we'll get out Monopoly, and we'll get it Monopoly Junior because he's younger, so we'll get Monopoly Junior. And we played it, and he liked it, and he wanted to request it and so forth, and I wanted to gouge my eyes out every time. Because like, oh, I love you, son, but boy, this is just an awful experience and so forth. So what if there was something that I actually want to, that I'm actually enjoying? I'm enjoying that I'm getting to do it with my son and my wife, and ultimately my second son as well, but like they're enjoying it and we're enjoying it and so forth, you know. So like it was nice last night that the little kids came up at the end of the Diana Ross concert. It's like, oh, well, this is nice. Like there's all these generations and they're enjoying the same thing. So that's fantastic. But I can't go to Diana Ross every night and so forth, unfortunately, you know. So what are some other things that can be done? Well, board games is a thing that can be done, but most of those games that we're familiar with, frankly, are if you look at it from an objective standard that I think exists, are poorly designed board games, and now there's lots of well-designed board games that everybody may well would likely enjoy. And so we can build those experiences together, that social capital together, naturally. And as the speaker this morning said, well, a game, like it isn't a game anymore if you don't voluntarily want to play it. And so again, this interaction, and I think that's an important point for the game, but even a more important point with this interaction with one another, like if I'm being forced to spend time with someone, even if I wanted to be, like that doesn't do as much as if, oh, we're all voluntarily coming together and we're all having this good time together and experiencing it. So I think that modern board games do that. And so it's hard to cover, well, what makes Settlers of Catan, you know, different and what makes a good board game. So what I tend to call a Euro game, and why, and they took off in popularity in Germany first, and then all throughout Europe, and so this is in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and it's not really into the 2000s that it jumps the pond and starts to become prevalent and popular in the United States and has really taken off. And American games, and there's a bazillion different categories now of games and types of games that you can do, so you can find some that you're interested in. But a Euro game tends to, what it was designed, and arguably because Germany got interested after World War II with it, but are games that they don't emphasize direct conflict with one another and so forth. So you're working, and Klaus Teuber, when he talked about Catan, he said, like, well, I wanted to emphasize like the cooperative building of society. And so instead of being like my society versus your society and we're fighting, it's, well, we're all building it is a competitive game, but we're all building at the same time, and I don't try to wipe out what you're doing, and you don't try to wipe out what I'm doing, and so forth, so we can build here kind of cooperatively or in a friendly way, and just at the end see who wins. Euro games they avoid luck. So American games traditionally have been like, well, that I will just roll the dice and see if I win or lose, or this works or not. And Eurogames, you tend to like, well, I can choose to do this or I can choose to do that, and have different strategies that develop that way rather than being highly dependent on luck. So the thought that you put into them really determines the outcome of the game. And a type of game that I for sure would emphasize for you is that they developed, and this game was mentioned this morning as well as a recommendation, but the game Pandemic was the first super popular cooperative game. And so in a cooperative game, you as a team fight the game. The game sets up a scenario, and then you as a group are all working to try to figure out how do we beat this scenario that's been set up by the game. So I'm working with my children or working with my friends or working with my wife trying to accomplish something rather than us trying to compete. And so a lot of people find that a more enjoyable and inviting experience to do it that way. So that's very briefly some differences of what a Eurogame is as opposed to kind of a traditional game as most people in America would think of it. So it builds capital in the family. It can build social capital in the community as people get together, and you can have game nights and and so forth. And you will be surprised that lots of people will start showing up like a bowling league and say like, well, I would like to try. Let's work out and play these different games. All right, well, board games can have some other benefits as well. I am interested in education and follow the history of education and so forth, and board games have always been a part of education. Now, I'm not an advocate for what I would call edutainment and so forth. I don't think that the classroom or schools should focus on entertaining students, so the board game use in a classroom is limited, but during downtime it can be a more productive thing than other potential activities. And board games can teach subject-specific material. So there's so many board games out now that any subject almost that you might be interested in is covered in a board game, and sometimes you'll just naturally learn information because it's contained in the board game itself or in that era, or geography from the map that you're using. So it can be subject specific to develop knowledge. There's such a thing called executive function. And so a lot of educators say executive function is more important even than IQ for predicting success in the classroom. And it's a little bit of a nebulous term in my opinion, but nevertheless, I think there's something to it. And that executive function is like, well, how well are you at choosing, essentially critical thinking, of being able to be patient and wait and decide between things, have a plan and see how it executes out and so forth. And so arguably board games, there's evidence that they develop executive function in young people and that gets their brains functioning in such a way that makes them good thinkers. And then morally, board games can be valuable as well. There's the natural thing of that you're going to lose sometimes with board games, and so can you be a good loser? Can you be a gracious winner with the board games? But also you can have games that are developing choice, so or getting at, people have always used board games to try to teach morality. So the game that you know is Chutes and Ladders is known around the world as Snakes and Ladders, and is a variation of an ancient Hindu game that was trying to teach reincarnation, so forth, of lessons on reincarnation. And the best-selling game in the United States is Monopoly, which ironically was created in the 19th century by a woman, Lizzie McGee, who was trying to teach about the dangers of capitalism and was advocating for Henry George's single tax and so forth, and wanted to teach these moral lessons make a commentary about capitalism. Parker Brothers didn't take it in that direction exactly, but nevertheless. And I think that people recognize sometimes that the board games can teach these lessons. So famously, Fidel Castro banned Monopoly in Cuba. The Soviets banned it in the Soviet Union. The Chinese at one point had banned Mahjong. And so they periodically, different political groups will say no to that, this or that board game. All right, so I think that there's potential for board games, as I say, as I've said, in schools, potentially in the school library. Maybe we could make some available and kids could check those out and take them home. Community centers in similar type of things. And lots of libraries around the country have started to incorporate board games into their offerings. And my suggestion is to use that potentially I would like to see organizations use the space they have. So what do board gamers need? Like, I guarantee you they'll have the games, but what they need is a space to play them in, like tables and a place to gather to do that. And it's kind of like, if you build it, they will come and so forth. So if you let them come, they'll come and play games there. And I think you could have families gather there. I think it's an opportunity for churches if they open up their fellowship halls and so forth to have people come. They'll find that if you have board game night, people will come, and people that wouldn't normally come to your church or come to your library or come to your school or interact with you will start coming, and that might grow that. And certainly we can open up our homes in similar ways and have similar accomplishments. All right, well, it's not all, what might stand in the way of that idea or ideal that I lay out, that rosy ideal. I think a few things. One, misperceptions about the hobby, which I'm kind of, in some ways, have already dealt with. So most people's experience, and again, I'm not attacking anyone that really likes Monopoly or you really liked Mousetrap or something. I don't, whatever game you like, that's fine. But most people don't like those games. And so lots of people think, oh, I wouldn't really enjoy, I've tried board games in the past, I don't like them. I'm not, and some people are never going to like board games. I'm a realist about that and so forth. But there's a good chance you haven't tried like really well-designed contemporary board games. And even like the Settlers of Catan is considered now limited as like, oh, there's some obvious flaws with Settlers now that games that are produced now would try to would smooth out some of the edges of Settlers of Catan and so forth. So another element of Euro games is, like typically in like a Risk or a Monopoly, like someone gets eliminated and it's like, well, that's no fun. And like the game continues and I'm out. Or I know that I'm out of the game, but I still have to sit here. Like in Euro games, like you never know, they're specifically designed so you don't know until the end who really has won. And you can still be happy with what you accomplished without knowing that. So in any event, if you think, oh no, I hate board games, I just encourage you to have an open mind and maybe try a couple of the new style of games that might be something that you enjoy more than you anticipate. As a minor one, there can be some sticker shock. So if you go to a big box store and get Monopoly, it's $12 or $14. If you go and get the Settlers of Catan, it might be $40 or $50 or $60 and so forth. And so I was like, well, wow, I don't want to spend that much. But when you think about it, that's not really that much. So if you went out to the movies, it's going to be $40, $50, $60 to take your family to the movies for a one-time 2-hour experience where you didn't really interact with them. You just were sitting by each other while you watch a big screen. Whereas a board game, you get that 2 hours experience directly interacting with one another, sitting around a table with one another, and you can do it again and again and again and again if you want it. And then this is a sensitive one, I suppose, but I wrote on here, geeks, nerds, and cancel culture. is a problem, is, I think, problematic. So you're trying to appeal to your children and teenagers and so forth. And we've also gone through this weird part of society, and for board games, like there is the most important board game site, which lists every game in the world and reviews them all and gives you all this information and will have videos on how to play them and so forth, is called Board Game Geek. They're like, oh, why did you have to call it Board Game Geek? And the best online store, I encourage you to go get it from a local store, but the biggest online store for board games is called Game Nerds. Like, ugh, like why did you have to, like, I'm past worried about people if they think I'm a geek or a nerd or something, but like why do you have to identify like lots of people reasonably don't want to be considered a geek or a nerd because they're doing this activity. And I don't think that you are, but lots of people who really like board games identify as geeks and nerds, and I think that can turn other people off of like, well, I don't want to be a part of that. So, so I mention it. And the maybe particularly sensitive one is, and I know you all would maybe identify or understand this, but unfortunately politics and cancel culture and so forth is even infecting the board game world. And so the board game world prides itself on being inclusive, and I'm arguing that it is inclusive, and I'll be closing by saying, like, I have people that I'm friends with that I never would have been friends with if I didn't like playing board games and didn't gather with folks with board games. But at the same time, that culture is starting to infect where people are unfriendly or will cancel you if you like a certain thing or a game. And so at that Board Game Geek site, like I've participated at that for over a decade, and I'm officially a rebel. I'm now banned from saying anything, from writing any comments on Board Game Geek, because about 6 months ago or a year ago, they popped up a thing for me saying like, well, what do you think of this game Nevada City, which is one of my favorite games. And Nevada City takes place in the 19th century in Nevada City and Nevada and so forth, and you are you're running your little ranch family and so forth and competing with other ranch families, and you can have children and marry your children off and so forth and make your family bigger and have your kids do stuff. And in the game, horror of horrors, maybe I guess for some, like when you marry your children off, they have to marry somebody of the opposite sex, because it's 19th century Nevada City, Nevada. And so they popped up a thing that said, well, isn't this bad? What do you think of them not allowing same-sex marriage in Nevada City, board game in Nevada City? And I commented, it was like, oh, well, I like that they kept it historically accurate. And they said, well, you're not allowed to say that. And it was like, well, what do you mean? And I looked at the rules and I made it even and tried to follow very closely that, like, well, I am a history professor. I like history, and this is accurate for what it would be like. And they said, you're not allowed to talk anymore on our site. And I was like, well, that's not very inclusive anymore. So now I'm banned from Board Game Geek. So. But anyway, so I do fear that culture is undermining some of the benefit that board games could potentially have. But just some statistics, most generations do find board games enjoyable. So again, I think grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, and the kids can all play together, and it's highly likely that they would enjoy that. And I think the older generation's lower percentage is, again, maybe part of this misperception that, well, you haven't experienced these newer types of games and they might be better than what you're thinking. For me, whatever that's worth to you personally, again, it was about 12 years ago that my wife and I started playing board games with our son, and now with both of our sons. It's proven itself a great activity for our family. It's been a great experience with the community. A few years ago, I thought when I was in my 20s, I was in lots of weddings, you know, as a groomsman or best man or whatever. But I thought once I got out of I thought my wedding days were long past, that and a couple years ago, I was a groomsman in a wedding again from my board game community and so forth, from this person who I have almost nothing in common with, but we got to know one another because of board games, and he put me in his wedding and so forth. So it's been quite a experience. So I work at the college, and it's been great as colleagues. We've mixed together departments that wouldn't normally do it. It's been wonderful for the students. We have students come over all the time and play, and so college students are playing with my 11-year-old and my 17-year-old, and why would they come over and do that other than for board games? So it's enabled that, and with us, and the parents really enjoy that type of thing, and it's helped me have activities and stimulate different parts of my mind and so forth. So it's been a wonderful experience. So around the corner, I have a lot of put out some games you can look at for ideas, and a sheet of ideas you can think of. And this is considered the most popular gateway, which gets people started in the game now, even more than Settlers of Catan. And so before you know it, you may have a bookshelf like that, which isn't, again, I don't sell board games, so this isn't my goal. But this ultimately is my goal, is that, that I hope you'd have more experiences where things are looking like that. And if you have more experiences where things are looking like that, that's good for me and society and the country as well. So I thank you for your attention and your time.
Jason, for those of us who, I have to admit, when I engaged him, I had never heard of Catan. Okay? My grandchildren came from Denver with the game. They tried to explain it to me. Would you take a few minutes and what does the game entail? What's the bottom line message?
Catan, it used to be called, it originally was called Settlers of Catan. Now they've shortened it just to Catan. But Catan is this fictional island, and there's up to 4, although you can get an expansion and make it up to 6 players. But each player is trying to develop settlements at Catan. And so you make points every time you make an advancement on your settlement, and the first to 10 points wins, is the simplest version of it, and so forth. Yeah, you're building farms and cities and roads and so forth on there. Okay. But it's very abstracted in it, and I meant to say again, or just to look at this in one additional way, like it's hard to give any game, I can't imagine that brief description is like, well, that doesn't sound all that interesting, like why would I want to do that? It's kind of an abstract thing, and if you look at it just as that abstract thing, but what you find about board gamers is they almost universally are just passionately evangelistic about the games. And ultimately, though, I don't think it's about the games. I think it's about the experience that the games facilitate. So I think Settlers of Catan, I think Catan is fun. I think there are games I enjoy more, but ultimately I'm trying to evangelize, I think, this experience, that they facilitate an experience that I'm open to suggestions, but I just don't know that many activities that facilitate those type of interactions on a regular basis in our society. But the list of activities that isolate us is longer than my leg. And so we're just becoming more and more isolated. We used to work together. We used to go to school, but now we warehouse our children. We warehouse our old folks. Everybody goes to work on their separate jobs and so forth. We come home, and like I said, we go to different rooms to watch our television shows. We constantly we're interacting with somebody technically on our phone maybe, but ultimately we're just scanning on that, and we're just isolating ourselves so much that I don't know how to get us. We need to come back together, and I don't know how to do that, but I know that board games, Catan and others, do that some. And most people enjoy the the activity. I'm not doing it just for this, well, gee, I know I've got to interact with my wife and my kids, so I guess I'll do it with the kids. But it's like, well, I know I need to do that, and I do that, and I want to do that because I also enjoy playing this game.
Minecraft, which I think most people are aware of, they're showing your connection like that. I know that's a game that's played online as opposed to a board game. Mm-hmm. How does that differ from what you're talking about?
Right, and it was mentioned, and I'm not being hostile in any way, but the speaker this morning, just as a contrast, was focused on and makes computer games and games on your phone, and those I just don't think are as good because of what I've just said. Like, those are ultimately isolating you. That technically you can play that. I can, I let, my youngest son has played a little bit of Minecraft, but it's highly limited. But when he plays it, he's by himself. Like, he's not interacting with me or anyone else, or if he is with somebody else, it's not even on the couch. I used to think it's like, well, maybe I can use video games and play with my son on the couch with him. It's hard to find a video game even that'll let you. It's all online and you're just interacting online, and that's a different, and we could get into the science of it, but I think that it's rewiring. The electronics you need to be careful with. It is rewiring your brain. And what you do physically does rewire your brain. And so sitting around a table playing a tactile game with people that you can see and interact with is a very different experience and is what I'm advocating for, much more than an activity where I would sit by myself on a couch and interact with an electronic screen and have electronics going off in my head. I'm not,
Some people have said that the games that the kids play, which are full of violence in many cases, has led to, how can I say it, an immunization on their part from violence. And that when they go out and they see it, or they might even perpetrate it, do you find, or have you found that there's a direct link there, or not?
Well, there's all kinds of studies that people fight that out, and I can show you a study that says this, and someone else will show you a study that says that. But I think that obviously, you don't have to look at studies to know that what you take in visually that desensitizes you, whether it's violent material or sexual material or whatever. Like, it takes more and more and more to get the same dopamine hit, to get the same brain reaction, the more that you've had those type of experiences. So I do think it's naive not that everybody that plays a violent video game is going to go shoot up a mall, but I think it's naive not to recognize, and I think even the video game industry, that's why they put ratings and so forth on them, know that it has to have some type of impact. And again, I just don't think it's nearly, for a lot of reasons, as healthy, and it certainly isn't building community to, again, be there on a video game, whether it's violent or it's not, the way that a board game is. And a lot of these board games are designed for that positive interaction. Settlers of Catan, Teuber specifically, in many quotes, is like, oh, I wanted to build a game that's not violent. It's about us all building up society together. And then we have games that are specifically, we're going to cooperate. We're not competing at all with one another. We're going to see if we collectively can accomplish something in this game.
If there are no other questions, before you leave.
Oh, there's one back.
Okay.
Are you familiar with the board game Public Assistance, which was a civil ban in the 1970s? And would you comment on it?
Oh, unfortunately, I can't comment. I don't know. It vaguely rings a bell, but I'll have to look into.
It's a great program. I love the Tigers on it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I did not know about that.
Anybody else? Okay, before you leave, we would like to make a special presentation to Dr. Edwards. And he's going to go with it right now. Not her, it's the boss.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
to me like a mentor.
I will do that. Thank you. Thank you very much.